Occurring halfway through the 19th century, the Compromise of 1850 would essentially be the final successful attempt to calm rising sectional tensions before the U.S. itself was torn in half. Hi everyone, my name is Mitch and I love history. I'm here to talk to you about important people, events, battles, and aspects of history that you may already know about, you may know a little bit about, you may just remember something from your sophomore history class with Coach Jones. But I'm here to kind of elaborate on some of that stuff and help you understand why history is still important today. So the Compromise of 1850 was actually a series of bills that were cobbled together and passed through Congress in the year, you guessed it, 1850. It's easily one of the most important political milestones in all of American history because it encompassed so many different elements. And studying it lets us look at the bigger picture and the bigger debates that were going on in the US at that time. So what did the Compromise bills do? Well, they actually did a bunch of small things, but really there are 5 main key elements to the Compromise that you should probably know about. First and foremost, the boundaries of Texas as a state were officially set. Second, the state of California entered the Union as a free state. Third, the New Mexico and Utah territories were given the choice to use popular sovereignty to decide in the future whether they would be free or slave. And fourth, the slave trade was ended in the District of Columbia. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was put into place. The easiest way to see how important the Compromise was in its time is to look at each key part individually to get a sense of how it all worked. So let's begin by messing with Texas. That's such a bad joke. Texas was annexed as a state by the U.S. in 1845, and this would kick off the Mexican-American War in the following year. This war was actually where a lot of later Civil War generals got their start, but many Americans in general disagreed with the war. Ulysses S. Grant was an officer during it, and he would later write in his memoirs that the war was, quote, one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. So tensions around Texas had been high for a while, but most importantly, debates around what to do with Texas ended the gag rule in Congress. Since the 1830s, there was kind of a rule in government that any mention of slavery would be avoided at all costs, simply because everyone knew that it was such a hot-button issue. When the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, Texas was firmly secure in U.S. hands as a slave state, but its borders were still unclear. For example, Texas initially included half of current New Mexico, massive chunks of Colorado, and bits and pieces of other territories. No one was really sure what to do, since parts of it were above the Missouri Compromise line. What the Compromise of 1850 did, then, was set the boundaries of Texas to its modern, current, weird shape that we have today. Now that Texas was included in the Union, we had 15 free states and 15 slave states by 1850. But when California applied to become a state, it threatened to end this precarious balance. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 and 49 really had huge effects on its rapid turnaround from a territory to meeting the population requirements to become a state. Northerners, when California was admitted, were obviously happy because it came in as another free state. Southerners were kind of mixed on their feelings. They were happy, or content, let's say, because it opened easy access to trade in the Pacific, and that could potentially benefit the nation as a whole. But it could really throw everything into chaos because now it meant that there was one more free state over slave states. It's important to know and remember that for decades before this, Southerners had become increasingly paranoid about maintaining their power because it was ultimately just propped up by the 3/5 Compromise. But still, the New Mexico and Utah territories gave them hope for the future of slavery. As I kind of alluded to, Southerners firmly stood by the belief that slavery had to expand into new territories if it was going to survive. For the most part, this was restricted to expanding into the American West. But some Southerners even tried invading other countries. They invaded Mexico or tried to invade the Caribbean countries and expand slavery in there for America. That's really interesting, and I'll do a later video on it in the future. Many Americans, for the most part, assumed that New Mexico and Utah territories would become free, simply because the soil that was there wasn't really great for cash crops like cotton or tobacco, the crops that slavery really relied on. But in order to get some of the things that they wanted passed, Northern senators like Lewis Cass and freshman Senator Stephen Douglas offered to let the people of the territories themselves vote to become free or slave states upon their admission to the Union. This concept was called popular sovereignty, and although it might sound kind of somewhat reasonable, it was really a recipe for disaster, as I'll discuss in a future video on Bleeding Kansas and popular sovereignty as a whole. So that covers the first three aspects of the Compromise of 1850. Now note that each of them really dealt with territory and the free versus slave state debate. But the fourth main element of the compromise was the end of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now notice that I said end of the slave trade. You could still own a person in the district completely legally. Still, for many, this was an important step in the right direction. Before this, there were slave auctions happening on the same block as the Capitol. For everyone who opposed slavery, the hypocrisy was obvious. Many people asked how could the U.S. support slavery while proclaiming to be the great free democracy and protector of liberty. More importantly, how could people be sold on the same street where the bastion of liberty was being governed? But finally, it was also an important foreign diplomacy move. Britain had abolished slavery in 1833. And France abolished it in 1848. Ambassadors from powerful nations like these detested walking by slave auctions on their way about town. In the end, though, just as with the rest of the nation, it would take a bloody civil war and hundreds of thousands of deaths for slavery to be ended in America's capital. Finally, we come to the most complicated and arguably most important part of the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act. Since America's founding, slave owners had always complained of slaves running away to free states and Canada. The new Fugitive Slave Act made it a federal crime to not arrest someone who was suspected of being a runaway, or for anyone to help a suspected runaway. There were already similar laws in place across the country, but they were pretty much ignored by Northern law officials and civilians alike. This was because they saw slavery as a Southern issue, and they just didn't really want to get involved or care about it. But now, law officials could be fined tens of thousands of dollars in today's money if they didn't arrest someone who was even rumored of being a runaway. For civilians, they could be imprisoned if they were caught helping a fugitive slave in any way. On top of all of this, the system under the new fugitive slave law was inherently corrupt. People accused of being fugitive slaves were not allowed to appear before a jury or have any legal defense. Instead, the laws stated that they would appear before a single official. And this is where things get really terrible. The person who judged you was rewarded based upon how they ruled. For example, if they found you to be legitimately free, then the judge received $5 as compensation. But if they believed that you were a runaway, the judge received $10. All that this required was for one white person to suspect you to be a runaway. And your chances really weren't that great with compensation for judges like that. Northerners were not happy with this for a lot of obvious reasons. Most importantly, though, this act succeeded in breaking through their apathy towards slavery. It was no longer something that could be ignored, something that was just a Southern issue. But it was something now that was in their backyard, because maybe they knew someone who was a runaway. Or even if they didn't, if they didn't do anything when someone else was suspected of being one, all of a sudden they could get in trouble. What's also really interesting about this is that many people thought that it was a gross violation of people's rights and states' rights. Now, we don't normally associate states' rights with the North, but the fact is that before the Civil War, Northern states were more often concerned with states' rights as opposed to the federal government than Southern states were. And this is a prime example of how. Each Northern state handled the response to the Fugitive Slave Act differently. Some states passed things called personal liberty laws, which protected the rights of African Americans to legal counsel and trial by juries. Wisconsin went so far as to completely nullify the act in 1855, and they said that they just wouldn't enforce it at all. Now, the response to this was that President Millard Fillmore threatened to send federal troops to any state that refused to enforce the act, but Wisconsin and other states held firm. Even those Northerners who didn't have a moral or political disagreement with the act or slavery disliked it now fiscally. It became extremely expensive for Northern states to enforce the act because it meant that they had to use police or use troops to imprison the suspected runaways and then escort them south just in case anyone tried to free them. So in the end, the Compromise of 1850 remained just that, a compromise. Neither side really got what they wanted, and the troubling questions that had forced the hand of Congress remained simmering under the surface. Most Americans breathed a little easier, though. If you had told any one of them that war would break out 10 years later, most would have just laughed it off and thought you were crazy. It's easy to look at these things and see war as inevitable, but that's incredibly dangerous to do, especially with a modern perspective. Still, the truth is that the compromise was more of an armistice than a solution, and both sides had put down their arms for the time being. Salmon P. Chase, a first-term Free Soil senator from Ohio and future Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln, saw all of this. He said, quote, "The question of slavery in the territories has been avoided. It has not been settled. That question will be settled once and for all just a decade later. But one can say that the legacy of slavery has yet to be resolved today." Thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned something. If you liked the video, just let me know, and let me know if there's any topics or things that maybe you're interested in that you would like to know more about, and I can try and make a video on that. If you want to follow me elsewhere, I have a website and an Instagram that I will link to in the description. Thank you for watching again, and have a good day.